December 1941. Tokyo. A marble-floored briefing room hums with quiet confidence. Navy officers lean over maps of the Pacific, cigarette smoke curling into the winter air. Red circles mark Pearl Harbor, Manila, Singapore. Around the table, senior commanders nod. Convinced the American fleet lies crippled, its factories idle. Soft industry. One admiral murmurs, "They'll take years to replace a single ship." Laughter ripples. The Japanese High Command believes time itself is their ally, that their empire will entrench before America can awaken. But across the Pacific, on the fog-drenched docks of California and Oregon, a different sound begins to rise. Sparks flash from welding torches. Steel plates slam into place under floodlights that never dim. Men and women, farmers, students, mechanics, trade their tools for hammers and wrenches. The rhythm of rivets becomes America's new battle drum. By the end of 1942, the laughter in Tokyo would fade. For what began as a trickle of merchant ships would soon turn into a steel tidal wave. The Liberty Fleet, rolling from the Atlantic to the Pacific, faster than any navy on Earth could sink them. The Empire had underestimated America's true weapon, its factories. In the first weeks after Pearl Harbor, America seemed stunned, a sleeping giant suddenly shaken awake. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice filled the airwaves, calm but heavy with resolve. A date which will live in infamy. Yet behind that speech stood an industrial challenge so vast that even Roosevelt's advisers questioned whether it could be met. The United States had the manpower and the resources, but not the time. Japan's Imperial Navy controlled most of the Pacific. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and the lifeline of supplies to Britain and Allied outposts was collapsing. Every day, Allied ships went down faster than new ones could be built. By early 1942, German submarines sank over 600,000 tons of shipping per month. In London, Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic the one thing that truly frightened him. Without cargo ships, the Allies could not move soldiers, fuel, or food. The war could be lost not in battle, but in the factories and shipyards that fed the front lines. America's shipbuilding industry had been modest before the war. A patchwork of private yards, outdated dry docks, and small workforces still recovering from the Great Depression. The U.S. Maritime Commission, created in 1936, had begun modernizing the merchant fleet, but progress was slow. Shipbuilding, at that time, was still an art, not an assembly line. Each vessel was handcrafted, riveted together piece by piece, taking months, even years, to complete. In Japan, military planners took comfort in that reality. Their intelligence officers reported that the United States, despite its industrial size, lacked the ability to mass-produce large ocean-going ships quickly. They imagined America bogged down by bureaucracy, slow union rules, and what they saw as a soft civilian workforce unfit for war production. But Roosevelt's administration saw it differently. The president declared, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." To win, America would have to build faster than the Axis could destroy. The answer came in a form few expected. A simple, almost crude cargo ship called the Liberty Ship. Its purpose was purely practical: carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the ocean, cheaply and quickly. Speed in the water was secondary. What mattered was speed in construction. The first prototypes, modeled after a British tramp steamer design, were plain and unremarkable. Some critics mocked them as Ugly ducklings? Even shipyard workers doubted they would survive long at sea. But to men like Henry J. Kaiser, a construction magnate with no background in shipbuilding, those doubts were fuel. Kaiser had built dams, tunnels, and bridges, projects where efficiency and logistics mattered more than tradition. He believed ships could be built like cars, using prefabrication, modular construction, and non-stop shifts. Instead of thousands of riveters hammering by hand, Kaiser's yards turned to welding, a faster and cheaper method that replaced rivets with continuous seams of molten metal. The idea was revolutionary. Prefabricated sections could be assembled in parallel, each built in separate workshops, then welded together on site. One team might build the bow, another the stern, while others fitted engines or deck houses. Once completed, the sections were lowered into dry dock like puzzle pieces. What had taken 200 days or more could now be done in weeks. At first, the old shipbuilding establishment scoffed. Welding, they warned, would lead to brittle hulls. Prefabrication, they said, was too chaotic. But Kaiser and the Maritime Commission pressed forward, opening new yards in Richmond, California, Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. Thousands poured in from across the country, farmers, teachers, women, and immigrants, all trained from scratch. For many, it was their first job in heavy industry. Soon, America's shipyards became cities unto themselves. Cafeterias, child-care centers, and round-the-clock floodlights kept the lines running day and night. Each torch spark symbolized not just production, but defiance. For every ship the Axis sank, America would build more, faster than they could count. By mid-1942, the first Liberty ships began sliding down the ways in numbers that startled even their creators. It wasn't perfection. Early hull cracks and rushed welds revealed flaws, but the principle worked. Quantity had become a weapon. And as these ugly ducklings began crossing the oceans, Japan's earlier laughter began to fade. What they had dismissed as weakness was becoming America's greatest strength, the ability to outbuild, outlast, and overwhelm. By late 1942, the American home front no longer resembled a peacetime nation. It had become a vast engine, a continent turned into a single, synchronized factory. The old skepticism about industrial mobilization had vanished. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, shipyards in Richmond, and lumber yards in Oregon all pulsed to the same rhythm. Production without pause. The Maritime Commission's emergency shipbuilding program began to yield results that defied imagination. What had once taken half a year now took less than 2 months. Each Liberty ship required over 250,000 individual parts, yet every bolt, beam, and boiler was catalogued and delivered with mathematical precision. Rail lines fed shipyards day and night. Convoys of trucks carried prefabricated sections from inland plants to the coast. The logistics network itself became a silent miracle. A web of men and women who never saw the sea, but built the vessels that crossed it. Henry J. Kaiser's name spread through Washington like legend. His California yards alone employed more than 100,000 workers, running 3 shifts under towering arc lights that erased the night. Production charts pinned to factory walls rose steeply month after month. Newspaper headlines called it the miracle of the West. In the eyes of Roosevelt's planners, Kaiser embodied the new kind of warfare, not one fought by admirals and generals, but by engineers, welders, and foremen. Each Liberty ship was plain, 441 feet long, a gray hull with a single stack and a single gun on the stern. They carried munitions, food, vehicles, oil, and sometimes soldiers. No one admired them for beauty, but for every vessel that disappeared beneath U-boat torpedoes, 5 more were launched to take its place. The German Navy called it the ship flood, an industrial onslaught their submarines could not contain. Yet the psychological dimension was even more profound. In 1942, Japan still believed that the United States lacked the will to sustain a long war. Japanese naval intelligence officers had calculated American shipbuilding potential based on pre-war data, figures that were already obsolete before the first Liberty ship touched water. Their models predicted perhaps 6 million tons of new shipping per year. The real figure would surpass 38 million tons by 1945. Japanese commanders viewed their early victories, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, as proof of American decline. But what they failed to see was that the same attack that had destroyed Pearl Harbor had also unified America in a way no propaganda could. Every family that watched the smoke rise from Hawaii understood that their work, their shifts, their hours mattered. At the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, foremen tracked production times with giant clocks. The record for fastest construction became a competition among workers. The ship Robert E. Peary was famously assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, an event broadcast across the nation. Crowds cheered as the vessel slid into the bay, flags waving, workers still in their welding masks. The point wasn't the record itself. It was the symbolism, the proof that the impossible could be done when a nation decided it must be. By the end of 1943, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, a feat without precedent in human history. From the East Coast to the West, the slipways roared, echoing across bays and rivers. Every launch ceremony became a ritual of defiance against tyranny. Names were painted on hulls honoring universities, towns, and heroes. Each ship carried with it the fingerprints of thousands of anonymous citizens. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japan's naval strategists began to notice something deeply unsettling. Reconnaissance reports revealed that American convoys were not shrinking despite relentless submarine attacks. In fact, they were growing, longer, heavier, more frequent. Japanese analysts struggled to explain how a nation that had lost much of its Pacific fleet could suddenly replace its merchant shipping so fast. Some dismissed the data as Allied deception. Others quietly feared the truth. That industrial capacity itself had become a weapon more devastating than bombs. This was the silent turning point, not in battlefields or skies, but in assembly yards and dry docks. The Liberty ship was no longer a symbol of replacement. It was the embodiment of endurance, and that endurance would soon confront the Axis powers head-on, reshaping the course of global logistics and sealing the fate of empires built on arrogance. The Liberty ship program was not merely a triumph of numbers. It was a revolution in how human ingenuity, technology, and organization converged to redefine the concept of war production. For centuries, ships had been riveted. Thousands of metal pins hammered through overlapping steel plates by teams of workers who learned the trade through years of apprenticeship. Riveting was strong, proven, and familiar, but it was also slow. Each ship demanded millions of rivets, and every misalignment meant costly rework. Henry Kaiser and the Maritime Commission rejected that tradition. They replaced rivets with welding, fusing steel plates edge to edge with electric arcs. Welding saved time, material, and manpower. It also allowed prefabricated sections to be joined seamlessly, removing the need for overlapping plates and cutting weight. Yet, this innovation was not without risk. Early Liberty ships suffered brittle fractures, hulls that cracked in cold seas, sometimes splitting clean in half. Critics seized on these failures as proof that mass production had gone too far. But engineers quickly diagnosed the causes: impurities in wartime steel, poor quality control in extreme temperatures, and the stresses of welded seams under Arctic cold. By mid-1943, adjustments in steel composition and improved welding standards solved the crisis. In the end, welding became one of the war's greatest technological transformations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. Welding allowed ships to be built in parallel, not sequentially, a fundamental shift that multiplied output beyond anything the Axis could imagine. Kaiser treated shipbuilding like an assembly line, borrowing ideas from Detroit and applying them to the sea. Prefabrication turned shipyards into vast modular factories. In hundreds of inland workshops, ship components were built simultaneously: bulkheads, deck sections, sterns, and bows, before being shipped by rail to coastal yards for final assembly. When these sections arrived, cranes lifted them into dry docks like pieces of a giant puzzle. Instead of waiting for each phase to finish, work teams specialized. Welders welded, electricians wired, pipe fitters piped. The process was continuous, layered, and efficient. To sustain this rhythm, Kaiser built systems of extraordinary coordination. Detailed production charts mapped every task, every hour. Schedules were updated daily. Inefficiency was treated like sabotage. Yet Kaiser's genius lay in blending discipline with morale. Workers were not treated as cogs, but as soldiers in the industrial front. The impact was staggering. A Liberty ship could be launched every 3 to 4 days at peak production, a pace that shattered naval precedent. In 1943, the Richmond shipyard alone launched one vessel every 33 hours. For comparison, Japan's major naval yards could barely launch a single warship in the same span. The faces of this miracle were not professional shipwrights. They were ordinary Americans drawn from every background, every corner of the country. At the Kaiser yards, more than a quarter of the workforce were women, earning nicknames like Wendy the Welder and Rosie the Riveter. Thousands of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans found industrial work for the first time. Many had never touched a torch or blueprint before the war. Training centers sprang up beside the docks, teaching entire trades in weeks. Posters reminded workers of their mission: the faster you build, the faster they come home. Industrial labor became patriotic duty. Families worked opposite shifts. One spouse clocked in as the other clocked out. Cafeterias ran 24 hours. Children fell asleep to the rumble of cranes and sirens. The shipyards became living cities, self-contained worlds where the boundary between civilian and soldier blurred. This mobilization was America's quiet weapon. While Japan glorified the warrior, the United States glorified the worker. The shipyards became its battlefield, their sparks, the gunfire of industry. While this transformation unfolded, Japanese intelligence clung to outdated assumptions. Their naval attachés in Washington had once studied American yards in the 1930s, but by 1941, the scale of change had rendered those reports meaningless. They failed to recognize the exponential rise in production that prefabrication made possible. Reports sent to Tokyo in 1943 described excessive optimism among Americans, a belief that quantity can replace quality. Japanese strategists mocked this approach, convinced that superior craftsmanship would triumph over mass production. They were wrong. The war was no longer about perfection. It was about endurance, about replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. As Japanese naval officers toasted their early victories, they unknowingly watched their strategic advantage dissolve beneath the sparks of America's shipyards. And soon, those sparks would light the way to a logistical revolution, one that would change not only the course of the war, but the nature of industrial warfare itself. Every launch ceremony was a declaration of defiance. When the first Liberty ships took to the water, few outside the shipyards understood what they represented. To the workers, however, they were not just vessels. They were proof that democracy could fight back. Each new hull sliding into the sea symbolized not only progress, but purpose. At Richmond, San Pedro, and Baltimore, entire towns gathered for launch days. Brass bands played patriotic marches. Children waved flags. Names of local heroes, universities, and small towns were painted across the bows. Some ships bore names of recently fallen sailors or aviators, a reminder that each ton of steel carried human meaning. These moments were televised, photographed, and printed in newspapers nationwide. The imagery of constant progress, the next ship already on the slipway before the previous one had touched the water, sent a powerful message. It said, "America cannot be intimidated." The Japanese had intended Pearl Harbor to crush morale. Instead, the Liberty ships rebuilt it. The psychological balance of the war began to shift, not when Allied armies advanced, but when workers realized they could outproduce the empire that once seemed invincible. When the first Liberty ships launched, critics dismissed them as clumsy and unremarkable. They were slow, boxy, and crude. Their top speed was barely 11 knots, slower than most submarines on the surface. Sailors joked that if they saw a torpedo coming, they couldn't outrun it. They could only watch. But as the war intensified, the perception changed. The public learned that these ships were the backbone of victory. Propaganda films, posters, and radio broadcasts reframed them as humble heroes, the workhorses of the sea. Hollywood joined in. Newsreels showed welders in sparks and shadows, their movements cut to the rhythm of machinery. The message was clear. Every rivet, every plate, every hour mattered. The Liberty ship wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to win. Even the British, initially skeptical of America's mass production experiment, grew awed by the results. Prime Minister Winston Churchill reportedly remarked that the sheer volume of ships arriving across the Atlantic was a miracle of manufacture. The phrase stuck. The Liberty, miracle, and became shorthand for America's unstoppable industrial drive. Meanwhile, Axis propaganda shifted tone. Where once Japanese broadcasts mocked American industry, by 1944, they warned their citizens of the steel flood that could not be stopped. The irony was complete. What began as ridicule became fear. The Liberty ship story also carried a deeper moral current. It demonstrated that collective effort, not conquest, not ideology, could become a weapon. Unlike Axis war industries, which relied on forced labor and secrecy, America's production was public, voluntary, and celebrated. Women like Eleanor Otto worked alongside men, breaking traditional gender lines. African-American laborers gained skills and wages previously denied to them. For many, the shipyards became their first taste of equality, not in rhetoric, but in work. The shipyards embodied Roosevelt's belief that democracy could mobilize with discipline and purpose. It was proof that a free society, once aroused, could outwork and outfight any dictatorship. Each Liberty ship thus became a moral statement, a floating refutation of fascism's claim to efficiency and superiority. Even the Axis leadership took note. German Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, upon reviewing captured data on American output, later admitted that Nazi Germany had never truly understood how an open society could be so productive. They built as though the war were an engineering project, he said, and we could never match it. By 1943, Japanese naval officers began reporting an alarming trend. Despite successful submarine attacks, the number of American cargo vessels seemed endless. Convoys that should have dwindled were growing. Even as Japan's shipyards slowed under bombing and shortages, the U.S. yards accelerated. American analysts estimated that every Liberty ship sunk by the Axis was replaced within 2 weeks. The arithmetic became devastating. The Imperial Navy could not sink ships faster than the U.S. could launch them. Reports sent to Tokyo used cautious phrasing. Logistical superiority, industrial momentum, but their meaning was unmistakable. Japan was running out of time. The empire had entered a war it could not sustain against a nation that treated steel like grain, harvested, milled, and shipped in endless cycles. The Liberty ship program became a living demonstration that wars were no longer decided solely by generals and admirals, but by engineers, mechanics, and planners. It was a transformation not just in material, but in mindset, a prelude to the industrial scale of future conflicts. And soon, that realization would collide with battlefield reality, as Liberty ships began forming the logistical backbone of invasions that would push across every ocean. By the opening months of 1943, the first Liberty ships were no longer experimental. They were everywhere. Convoys that once limped across the Atlantic now stretched horizon to horizon. Gray hulls in endless columns, smoke trails blending into the winter mist. From the escort decks of Royal Navy corvettes, British sailors could scarcely believe the pace. Every week seemed to bring another flotilla of new American cargo vessels, each one fresh from the slipways of Portland, Baltimore, or Richmond. For Germany, it was a nightmare taking shape. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat fleet had ruled the Atlantic through the happy time, hunting convoys with ruthless efficiency. But the mathematics of warfare had shifted. The Allies had lost over 700 ships in 1942. By 1943, they were replacing them faster than they were sunk. The wolf packs prowled the same seas, but where once they had found rich prey, now they faced convoys too numerous to exhaust. Each Liberty ship carried the sinews of modern war. Sherman tanks lashed to open decks, crates of P-51 engines, mountains of tinned food and aviation fuel. When one went down, 10 more were waiting in port. German intelligence officers called it ein unendlicher Nachschub, an endless resupply. The strategic effect was profound. For the first time, the Allied High Command could plan offensives without fearing logistical starvation. The North African campaign turned from desperate defense into a steady advance as Liberty ships poured into Algiers and Oran, unloading jeeps, fuel drums, and artillery in a torrent of steel. British officers who had endured years of rationed supplies now watched warehouses overflow. Across the Pacific, the story repeated itself. The same yards that supplied the Atlantic convoys were now sending ships westward through the Panama Canal, bound for Australia, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. Japanese submarines, once confident hunters, found themselves firing torpedoes at convoys that never seemed to end. Their fuel dwindled. Their victories meant nothing. By late 1943, American yards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day. The Maritime Commission's statistics astonished even its own administrators. More than 140 launches every month, each a 10,000-ton symbol of inexhaustible resolve. Tokyo began to receive grim intelligence summaries. Japanese submarines reported convoys beyond counting. Naval staff officers compared output graphs and realized the truth. America's shipyards were producing more steel tonnage in a single year than Japan's entire navy possessed. In January 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Chief of Logistics, Vice Admiral Yamaji Kosaku, noted in a confidential memorandum, "Enemy production exceeds expectation by a factor of 6. The Empire cannot match this pace." It was an admission wrapped in understatement, but it marked the psychological collapse of Japan's industrial confidence. Back in the United States, the effect was the opposite. Shipyards competed to break their own records. At Richmond, the Robert E. Peary's 4-day build had become a national legend. New yards sought to outdo it. Radio announcers read out launch counts between swing band songs. Every new ship became a symbol of national identity. Ordinary citizens measured the war's progress, not in battles won, but in hulls completed. The Liberty Fleet soon became more than logistics. It was strategy. The vast invasion of Europe depended on it. In early 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower told Roosevelt bluntly, "Without these ships, we cannot invade." The Liberty program had turned that impossibility into a schedule. Convoy UGS-36, for instance, sailed for the Mediterranean in March 1944 with 60 Liberty ships escorted by destroyers and frigates. U-boats struck in the mid-Atlantic, sinking a handful, but by the time survivors were rescued, new ships were already loading at Norfolk to replace them. The enemy could no longer inflict meaningful loss. The curve of production erased each defeat as if it had never happened. In German war rooms, charts told the story brutally. Merchant shipping losses had peaked. U-boat sinkings were climbing. Allied aircraft, radar, and depth charges were taking their toll. But it was the industrial tide behind the convoys that truly doomed the campaign. Dönitz admitted privately, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Liberty ships made the island-hopping strategy possible. Each invasion, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, required a mountain of supplies. Before the war, such logistics would have taken years. Now, the Americans delivered them in weeks. Floating depots of Liberty ships anchored off beaches, offloading ammunition and vehicles around the clock. For every ship destroyed by Japanese air raids, several replacements were already steaming west from California. By mid-1944, the shipyards were so efficient that the U.S. Navy began converting Liberty hulls into specialized vessels. Hospital ships, repair tenders, troop transports. Their modular design made transformation easy, another advantage of prefabrication. In Japan, naval officers who had once mocked American inefficiency now faced the evidence of their misjudgment. Merchant sinkings no longer mattered. The industrial avalanche was beyond the reach of submarines, bombs, or hope. The ugly duckling had become the silent conqueror of two oceans. And yet, the tide of steel was still rising, soon to reach its zenith as the Allies prepared for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. By the middle of 1944, the industrial battle had already been won, even if the generals and admirals were still fighting at sea. In Tokyo, staff officers convened beneath the glow of electric lamps to study intercepted radio reports and shipping estimates. Their charts no longer offered comfort. Submarine patrols, once the pride of Japan's navy, returned with dismal results. Captains who had once sunk American tankers and freighters now complained of convoys without end. Each success was dwarfed by replacement. When one ship vanished beneath torpedoes, 10 others replaced it before the ocean had calmed. A secret memorandum circulated within the Imperial Navy's Logistics Bureau in August 1944 summarized the impossible truth. American merchant shipping capacity increases faster than attrition. Our campaign cannot achieve denial of transport. It was the polite phrasing of strategic despair. From the Pacific to Europe, the Liberty ship's influence could now be measured in tonnage and momentum. At Normandy, on June 6, 1944, Liberty ships formed the logistical skeleton of Operation Overlord. Off Omaha and Utah beaches, their cargo holds spilled out bulldozers, fuel trucks, and ammunition crates by the tens of thousands. Floating cranes lifted tanks directly from the decks, lowering them into shallow surf, while German artillery thundered inland. The miracle was not just their presence, but their timing. The Allied invasion required a ceaseless flow of supplies across the Channel. Every gun, every ration, every gallon of fuel came aboard a Liberty ship. Without them, the bridgehead could have collapsed within days. Instead, the convoys never stopped. By July, over 326,000 troops and 100,000 tons of equipment had crossed from England, sustained by the same industrial rhythm that had begun in Kaiser's yards years before. In the Pacific, the pattern was even starker. The Japanese military had once calculated that the United States could not maintain operations more than 3,000 miles from its home shores. Yet by 1944, Liberty ships were steaming from California to the Marianas, 5,000 miles of ocean, carrying entire divisions and their supplies. Convoy records from the U.S. Navy's Pacific. Fleet showed the scale. Hundreds of Liberty ships per operation, arriving like clockwork. At Leyte Gulf, over 700 vessels assembled in the largest amphibious force in history. Behind the warships and carriers stood the gray silhouettes of the Liberty fleet, the quiet backbone of an empire in reverse. For Japan, this was the breaking point. Even as its armies fought desperately on island after island, its commanders understood that every American advance rested on a logistical tide they could not match. Japan's merchant marine, which had once supported a sprawling empire, was collapsing under relentless attack. By 1945, over 80% of Japan's pre-war shipping capacity was gone. The nation that had once prided itself on naval supremacy now struggled to feed itself, let alone fight. Intercepted messages between Japanese naval bases spoke of shortages that bordered on starvation. Oil convoys from Borneo could no longer reach the home islands. Ammunition ships vanished at sea. The Liberty ships, by contrast, crossed the Pacific with mechanical precision. The sea that Japan had once ruled had turned against it, patrolled, supplied, and sustained by industrial power beyond comprehension. When American forces landed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Liberty fleet followed them like a shadow. Each new beachhead became a port, each port a highway of steel and cargo. Ships unloaded even under fire. Their crews civilian volunteers who had traded factories for the front line. They faced kamikaze attacks, storms, and torpedoes. Yet, the flow of supplies never faltered. A Japanese intelligence officer captured on Okinawa later testified, "We realized by then that America could not be defeated. Even if we sank 100 ships, 1,000 more would come." His statement, simple and exhausted, captured what Tokyo's strategists already knew. The Liberty ship had broken the moral equation of warfare. Traditional strategy relied on attrition, on wearing the enemy down faster than one's own losses. But the United States had rendered that logic meaningless. Attrition required scarcity. America had abundance. In Washington, the Maritime Commission's reports read like quiet triumphs. By the end of 1944, 2,510 Liberty ships had been completed, the largest fleet of identical ocean-going vessels ever constructed. Their combined cargo capacity exceeded that of the world's entire pre-war merchant marine. The scale was incomprehensible to Japan's leadership. In the final months of the war, intercepted diplomatic cables revealed Tokyo's growing despair. One message, sent from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin to Tokyo in February 1945, warned, "German factories cannot replace losses, but America builds with rhythm and certainty. The enemy has turned industry into warfare itself." By then, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Liberty ships carried supplies for the B-29 airfields in the Marianas, from which American bombers struck Tokyo night after night. The same industrial machine that built the Liberty fleet now built the weapons that would end the war entirely. From Tokyo's once proud naval offices, the laughter of 1941 was a distant echo. What had begun as mockery, soft Americans, slow builders, had ended as silence. The Empire of Japan had discovered that industrial power was not about machinery alone. It was about spirit, the collective will of a people who refused to surrender the rhythm of creation. The Liberty ships had proved it beyond doubt. No nation that could build so much, so fast, could ever be defeated. And in the ashes of that realization, the war's final chapter began. The reckoning of consequences that would reshape the modern world. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of the Liberty fleet continued across every ocean. When the war ended, harbors from Southampton to Manila were lined with the same unmistakable silhouettes: straight bows, single stacks, utilitarian gray hulls. The ships that had carried armies and supplies now carried the burden of rebuilding a shattered world. At their peak, Liberty ships had turned the tides of battle. In peace, they turned the tides of recovery. Nearly 2,400 of the 2,710 vessels survived the war, and thousands continued sailing under Allied and foreign flags. They delivered grain to starving Europe, transported refugees, and carried reconstruction materials to cities leveled by bombing. The same vessels that once supplied battlefronts now supplied humanity. In Britain, where wartime rationing continued well into 1947, Liberty ships arrived daily, stacked with food, coal, and machinery. Their crews were no longer under attack, but the mission remained the same: sustain life across oceans. To many Europeans, these ships became floating symbols of American abundance, proof that the industrial miracle that had won the war could also win the peace. The U.S. government sold hundreds of Liberty ships to private companies at a fraction of their cost, jump-starting the post-war merchant marine. Others were transferred under the Marshall Plan, their cargo holds filled with materials that rebuilt roads, bridges, and homes. Former wartime convoys now formed the arteries of international trade, but not all continued their service so quietly. Some ships, stripped of armament, were converted into hospital and research vessels. Others carried troops home from distant battlefields. When the troop ship SS John W. Brown arrived in New York Harbor in 1946, her decks were packed with returning soldiers waving to families who lined the docks. The ship that had once crossed torpedo zones now ferried peace itself home. Yet even in triumph, the Liberty Fleet bore scars. Many hulls had been pushed beyond their intended lifespan. Some were worn, rusting, or cracked from stress. They had been designed to last 5 years, long enough to win the war, not decades. But they kept sailing, stubborn and serviceable. Their welded seams, once controversial, had become the standard of modern shipbuilding. The sheer number of these vessels created challenges of its own. Ports overflowed with surplus ships, and storage fleets, known as mothball fleets, formed along American rivers and bays. Rows of Liberty ships sat idle, moored bow to stern in the quiet waters of the James and Suisun bays. Seagulls perched on railings where sailors once stood watch. They were monuments to an age when speed and necessity had outweighed beauty and longevity. Still, their legacy extended far beyond the docks. The Liberty program had transformed the American workforce. It had introduced mass production to heavy industry, trained millions of skilled laborers, and permanently altered social boundaries. Women and minorities who had entered shipyards during the war rarely returned to domestic life unchanged. Many sought careers in engineering, mechanics, and public service, carrying forward the momentum of the war effort into the peacetime economy. The Liberty ship also became a model for global shipbuilding. Nations studied its modular design, its prefabricated systems, and its simple maintenance. Countries rebuilding their own industries, from Britain to Japan itself, borrowed from the methods Henry Kaiser had pioneered. In a paradox of history, Japan's post-war shipyards would rise using principles first tested by its wartime enemy. To naval historians, the Liberty ship represented something profound, a democratization of industry. It showed that complex machinery could be built not by specialists alone, but by organized citizens united by purpose. In that sense, it was the physical embodiment of Roosevelt's vision, the arsenal of democracy made real, one welded seam at a time. As the 1940s gave way to the early Cold War, Liberty ships continued to serve quietly under new flags and new causes. They ferried supplies during the Berlin airlift, carried weapons during the Korean War, and hauled aid through the developing world. The men and women who had built them were older now, their faces lined by years of labor and pride, but their creation still sailed, defying rust, storms, and time itself. And as the world rebuilt upon the foundations they had delivered, the lessons of the Liberty ship endured, that speed, cooperation, and willpower could achieve what no empire's arrogance ever could. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the Liberty ship's wake stretched into a new kind of battlefield, economic, industrial, and moral. The same hulls that had once ferried tanks and rations across submarine-infested seas now carried the raw materials of reconstruction. In a quiet irony, they became instruments of the very peace they had helped to win. When American occupation forces entered Japan in late 1945, they found a nation starving and shattered. Cities lay in ashes, harbors clogged with wrecks. Shipyards that had once built proud cruisers and carriers were now silent, their cranes twisted, their forges cold. Yet within a few short years, these yards would rise again, rebuilt under guidance from American engineers, financed by the same industrial system that had outproduced them. Among the blueprints used for training were Liberty ship schematics, studied for their efficiency and modular logic. Japan's shipbuilders learned quickly. By the 1950s, those lessons would help launch the nation's post-war maritime renaissance. Across the Atlantic, the story was similar. Europe's recovery depended on movement: coal from Poland, food from America, steel from Britain, and Liberty ships made that possible. The Marshall Plan might have remained theory without the gray workhorses to deliver its promise. They became floating threads, stitching a divided continent back together, proving that logistics could be an act of mercy as much as war. Economists studying the period often point to the Liberty program as the foundation of modern supply chain thinking. It had transformed a scattered network of contractors into an integrated system. Steel mills synchronized with railroads, ports, and machine shops, coordinated through daily reports and constant feedback. That rhythm of coordination would define post-war American industry, from automobiles to aerospace. Strategically, the Liberty Fleet also left a permanent mark on military doctrine. The U.S. Navy and Army planners who witnessed the ship's effect on global operations realized that control of the sea no longer depended solely on battleships or carriers, but on sustained logistics. The phrase sea lift entered strategic vocabulary. Future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, would be fought with that lesson in mind. Victory favored the side that could move fastest, furthest, and longest. By the mid-1950s, newer classes of merchant and naval vessels had begun to replace the aging Liberty ships. Some were lengthened and refitted with stronger engines, reborn as Victory ships. Others ended quietly, sold for scrap in faraway ports. But a handful survived, preserved as museum ships or left at anchor as living memory. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco and the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore still float today, their decks echoing with the ghosts of welders and sailors who once built a world from rivets and resolve. For the United States, the Liberty program had proved something larger than industrial might. It revealed a social truth, that free citizens, when mobilized with purpose, could outwork empires built on fear. Every weld, every shift, every sleepless night in the yards had been a quiet assertion of democracy, proof that unity born of conviction could outlast tyranny born of obedience. Historians often describe the Liberty ship as the ship that won the war. But perhaps it did more than that. It changed the world's understanding of what war itself meant. No longer could conflict be decided by a few decisive battles. It was decided by factories, by the capacity to create faster than destruction could consume. The Liberty ship made that reality undeniable. In Japan's reborn ports, the irony deepened. By the 1960s, Japanese shipyards, rebuilt with American assistance, were producing merchant vessels larger, faster, and more advanced than any before. The students who had once studied Liberty blueprints now designed the supertankers and cargo giants of a new industrial age. The cycle had completed itself. What had begun as mockery, laughter at soft American industry, had ended as imitation. And so, as the 20th century moved into its second half, the Liberty ship remained a quiet constant, not in headlines, but in harbors and memories. It was proof that the tools of destruction could become tools of recovery, that the same welds that carried war could later carry hope. Beneath its plain steel plates, lay the story of an idea that in the darkest moments of history, human cooperation, guided by purpose and belief, can manufacture not just ships, but survival. The last Liberty ships faded from service in the 1970s, their names forgotten by most, but their legacy endured. Every container vessel, every modular construction project, every coordinated supply line bore their genetic code. They had outlived the war they were built for, and, in doing so, they had reshaped the peace that followed. In the quiet that followed the war, the Liberty ships grew old with grace. Their paint faded, their engines slowed, and the noise of the yards that had birthed them fell silent. Yet their story remained welded into the memory of a century that learned, through them, what endurance truly meant. They had no elegance, no sleek hulls, no polished decks, no romance of sails or ceremony. They were blunt, functional, and unpretentious. But in their simplicity lay something profound, a collective heartbeat, the sound of millions of ordinary people building toward one purpose. For the men and women who worked in those shipyards, each torch spark was an act of defiance, proof that democracy could outbuild dictatorship, that freedom could organize itself, and that unity could be measured not in speeches but in steel. The Liberty ship became a vessel not just of cargo, but of conviction. History remembers great generals and famous battles, yet wars are not won by glory alone. They are won in the invisible spaces, the factories, the foundries, the night shifts that turn raw ore into motion. The Liberty ships were those spaces made visible, floating across oceans to remind the world what determination can do. In the decades after the last of them left service, their lesson endured quietly. Every assembly line, every modular construction, every global supply chain carries the echo of their creation. They taught that human cooperation, when focused, organized, and driven by belief, could bend time itself. And in that truth lies the Liberty ship's final legacy. It was never just a ship. It was a promise that when free people choose to build rather than bow, when they answer destruction with creation, no empire, no arrogance, no enemy can prevail for long. From the laughter in Tokyo in 1941 to the silence of surrender in 1945, the world witnessed that promise kept, steel by steel, ship by ship, day after day, until freedom floated on every tide.